І я запрошую до слова нашого наступного спікера, це Кріс Вестон, і його сьогоднішня доповідь буде присвячена такій проблемі. Острів Корея, Північна і Південна Корея між геополітикою і геоекономікою.
Sorry. So first of all, I'd like to thank Pavlo for inviting me to Kyiv. I'm going to be talking about sort of Korea. Korea has actually been in the press quite considerably over the last few months. I was there just about a month ago. Obviously, the critical things that were taking place was again, issues with North Korea, ballistic missile tests, and also a possible further nuclear test. In the south, you're really seeing the sort of the outcome of, in fact, another form of populist revolt, but this time, essentially, hundreds of thousands of people had gone on the streets to seek the removal of the previous president, Park Geun-hye, who's effectively now essentially in prison awaiting trial for corruption. And then amongst all this playing out was news reports of US aircraft carriers en route to Korea, nuclear submarines, US nuclear submarines docking, and a lot of war talk about the Americans perhaps launching a strike in North Korea. Now, while I was there, essentially the whole place was very quiet. There were sort of 10 million sort of residents of Seoul who were essentially only about 50 minutes away from the border, were pretty well getting along with their business. And there was certainly no evidence of Americans basically preparing for any possible strike. And in fact, I went up to the demilitarized zone, which I will show you in a moment, and it was all very much peace and quiet. And that sort of brings back an issue, which is you can read a lot in newspapers and see a lot of TV programs talking about a critical situation, but actually the reality on the ground is considerably different. And I'll allude to that throughout the context of this talk. As people who will have been here at my last talk, I clearly like to bring in a bit of my sort of music tastes to try and carry the presentation along. So for this one, I've brought the pop group Fleetwood Mac, who are obviously one of the great groups of the 70s and 80s. And some of their lyrics, their songs, I find of interest in trying to understand what goes on in Korea. Now, obviously appreciate, I don't want to sort of spend the whole talk on the history, but I think it's quite useful just to sort of get a bit of background. The one thing that I think will strike people as unusual because of looking at the sort of the situation on the Korean Peninsula is actually, historically, Korea has been a very, very stable country, albeit it shares a history to a certain extent with both Ukraine and Poland, in that there have always been sort of external powers who've sometimes taken the opportunity of launching invasions. I think I was reading at some point that Korea had probably been subject to sort of dozens of invasions over time. But in fact, the stability is that there was one dynasty pretty well ruling the country for the better part of about 500 years, which, you know, goes to show that first of all, the country was under a certain amount of stable regime, and it also sort of points perhaps to other family dynasties of a more recent vintage, and I allude specifically to North Korea, because I think if there is one thing that's probably out there is that people underestimate the stability of that particular regime. Towards the 19th century, Korea started to become a bit of a playground for foreign powers. And what you'll see is essentially this has sort of effectively played into what is happening, or what has happened to Korea, essentially almost over the last 100 years. But what we saw towards the end of the 19th century was essentially Chinese influence in the Korean peninsula, essentially being superseded by Russian interest, imperial interests, but particularly Japan. And Korea essentially became a colony of Japan from about 1910, though Japanese interests prior to that were considerable. And Korea, as I said, became integrated into Japanese industry, and it actually became quite an important part of of the Japanese military-industrial complex, and was essentially ruthlessly exploited during that period of time. August 1945 saw the Americans come into the south of Korea. Of interest is, in fact, that the Soviet Union had sent troops into Manchuria, which is north of Korea, but due to an agreement that they had with the Americans, they essentially stopped at this artificial divide, the 38th parallel, which was effectively has no geographic significance, it has no historical significance in Korea's history, but it was just something that was sort of decided in a couple of hours by American civil servants as being the most convenient point at which to split the peninsula. Now, the Korean War that took place between 1950-53, a lot of people, particularly I'm thinking of Bruce Cummings, who's an American historian, big question marks over whether the Korean War did take place between 1950-53. He actually says that given the fact that almost 100,000 people were killed in South Korea in the 40s, sort of would make it suggest that perhaps the Korean War has an earlier timeline. But I think it's just worth bearing in mind what the actual outcome of that war was in terms of the human costs, because those costs essentially have carried forward. 5 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives, of which 1 million were Chinese. 3.7 million refugees were created, 100,000 war orphans, and 10 million separated families. A further aspect of this is also the fact that the Korean War was actually fought by the United Nations. So if you look in, for example, at the Korean War Memorial Museum, you'll see testimony by varied people, whether from Turkey or even from Ethiopia, I believe, who'd actually fought in this conflict. And the actual story is that 63 out of the 93 independent nations at that time were effectively engaged in the Korean War against North Korea, which also provides a reason why the North Koreans are very, very reluctant to see anything involving the United Nations. They still view them as essentially part of the enemy leveled against them. The Korean War, as said, concluded in 1953, but just with an armistice. So it's important to also further note that Korea is still technically at war. It is just regulated by this armistice agreement. 1953 onwards, I refer almost to it as really this sort of the Fleetwood Mac years, and essentially the lyrics of the song that you can go your own way, you can call it Another Lonely Day, inform what really has happened on the Korean Peninsula since 1953, which is essentially a divide that with considerable US forces still in the south, a point that I'll come to. But the systems that are in place have entrenched, and to all intents and purposes, mentalities have also become entrenched. Something that hopefully may yet change. And on the 9th of May 2017, there was a small step towards that possible change. On a 70% turnout, which was probably one of the highest that took place in South Korea, this individual, President Moon Jae-in, took office. He'd won the sort of presidential race, I think with 42%. The other two candidates got about 20% each. And essentially he has taken office with a considerable in-tray of issues to deal with. Some of those are of a domestic. The previous president, as I've alluded to, was impeached and is essentially facing trial for corruption. You have issues of corruption that were involving some of the biggest South Korean companies, the chaebols, heavily involved, surprise, surprise. Considerable levels of consumer debt, very low economic growth, and some very, very poor demographics. Perhaps not the most immediate issue, but South Korea has considerable issues in terms of a falling population, combined also with high youth unemployment. So he has a very considerable domestic set of issues, but probably more critical to him are the four that I've lined up on the left. The sort of the issues of geopolitics and geoeconomics suddenly coming very much to the fore. Let's just take a moment to talk about the US involvement. I've already alluded to the fact that there was a Korean War took place in 1950. Essentially, South Korea's security is underpinned by the US presence. There is still, even over 50 or 60 years after the war has ended, still 28,500 US troops based in South Korea with their families and dependents. But what is also important is that South Korea's economic prosperity and growth has also been underpinned by the United States. Visit to the sort of Contemporary History Museum in Seoul. At the end of one section, what is of interest is on the left, you sort of see, well, you know, South Korea started to export in the 1960s. A lot of that thanks very much to both the United States, which opened its markets to South Korean goods, also partly to the Japanese, the former colonial power, re-engaging with its former colony in the mid-60s. But it's the other side of the presentation, or sorry, the exhibition that really caught my interest, and the fact that South Korean troops were the largest component in the Vietnam War. The Americans gave officially aid of something of the order of $1 billion, which in the 1960s was serious money, certainly given the way the inflation is impacted, and the fact that a lot of the chaebols got really their beginnings in that Vietnam War. One notorious example, Hanjin Shipping, which has gone bankrupt spectacularly in the last few months, actually made all its money by transporting US troops over to Vietnam. And Hanjin at one point was essentially the owner of Korean Airlines. So the Americans have always been central to that Korean miracle, whether it's economic or also ensuring the security. What President Moon now has to contend with is a new president in the United States who has, and I'll just sort of go back to the point, the penultimate, who has, in the words of the Coco character from one of the Gilbert Sullivan, has got Korea on his little list. in addition to his pet hates of Angela Merkel, NAFTA, Mexico, Korea has also sort of entered the sort of the list of Trump's dislikes, and one of them is that he generally believes that they should be paying more for their defense, particularly the new anti-ballistic missile system, the so-called THAAD, which has created immense problems for South Korea with China. What Mr. Trump also has started to do, this was the issue last month, that, you know, there was talking up of a possible strike on North Korea. But interestingly enough, Mr. Trump is also a somewhat ambiguous, or not ambiguous, a person who can have two separate opinions at the same time. Because in fact, the actual phrasing coming out of the United States is, you know, wanting to apply maximum pressure, but also engagement. So maximum pressure and engagement. And therefore, I think for reasons that may not be obvious, in fact, Mr. Trump and his wish to sort of meet the North Korean leader may actually represent an interesting backdrop to what could possibly ensue in terms of a change in relations between the South and North Korea and the wider world. The final point, though, is something I'll talk probably a bit about tomorrow when I talk about the sort of Trump issue, is a big question comes up in terms of really who's in charge in Washington. Mr. Trump can make particular statements about, you know, wanting to launch a strike or to meet the leader of North Korea. But the reality on the ground is that it was the sort of defense secretary who visited Korea in January, and then I think visited again last month to provide the words of reassurance in terms of, you know, looking past the rhetoric and looking past prospective movements of aircraft carriers, which now we know that aircraft carrier was off the coast of Australia, a long way away from where it was supposed to be, according to Mr. Trump. I just want to talk a bit about the sort of the geography. I just want to make one thing. Generally, when I see maps of North Korea, I generally only just see this bit here, rather than this bit here of China. And I think, you know, unless you look at that very closely in the context of South Korea, the sort of geopolitics are sometimes not that obvious. But let me just sort of talk you through. I'm going to leave Russia out of the equation for the moment, purely because of time and whatever. But I just want to fasten on to this issues of China, the North, and particularly Japan. Again, the one sometimes when we see maps, you don't realize how close Japan is to the Korean Peninsula. China, let's just deal with China for the moment. Let's look at the sort of economics. About 26% of South Korea's exports go to China. It is essentially its largest trade partner, and in fact the exports are double that of what Korea now exports to the United States. That's a very important development that's taken place over the last 20 years. China imports 90% of its semiconductors from Korea. So when we talk about the sort of the assembly of mobile phones or all these electronics that China sells to Walmart in the United States or whatever, essentially South Korea is essentially fundamental to China's supply chain. The problems with China essentially emerge from the following. The problem that China has with a unification of the Korean Peninsula is that it sees very clearly what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union. And if there is one thing that China will not accommodate, is American forces moving up to its border. There. The other thing is that the Chinese have become exceptionally concerned about the way that South Korea has become a point of installing this anti-ballistic missile system that I alluded to, the THAAD, over the last few months, and it reacted exceptionally badly to that position. The THAAD, which is essentially here, has got the ability to look into China through its surveillance systems, and that essentially gives cause for concern for the Chinese that their nuclear deterrent could essentially be neutralized by the Americans very, very quickly. The Chinese reacted by essentially boycotting South Korean businesses that are present in China. The one particularly was the Lotte group. Lotte had actually sold the land for the THAAD system to be installed on. Lotte is a very, very significant retail group with considerable business interests in China. They suddenly faced boycotts along with other South Korean businesses, and a very important source of revenue for South Korea of tourism from Chinese tourists coming over were essentially, the Chinese have essentially said, you know, we don't want people going over to South Korea. So that boycott has caused considerable problems for South Korea, and that clearly is one of the things that President Moon is now trying to resolve. I think he was planning or had done a trip to Beijing to discuss parallel issues of North Korea and also dropping the effects of this sort of boycott on South Korean businesses. If I go to Japan, I've already alluded to the colonial background. The problems that are sort of there between the two countries is that essentially they still have issues over that colonial occupation, with Japan essentially rewriting history. There's also the notorious annual visits by Japanese politicians to the Yasukani shrine where Japanese war criminals are buried. You've also got issues of the comfort women, which were the Korean women who were used prostitutes for the Imperial Japanese Army during the war. And you also have a territorial dispute. But interesting, that said, Japan accounts for 5% of exports of South Korea, and Japan also accounts for 10% of imports of South Korea. So in other words, you know, this supply chain into South Korea and then into China is still an important geo-economic relationship. Let me just flip over. Now, I think the issue that we have is that despite all these sort of issues of tensions and the war, the case for the status quo still remains clear for virtually all of the neighbours of the Korean Peninsula. For China, we've said that the issue is that they will not countenance US troops. There is also another angle I just wanted to talk about here, which is the US has got a major military base in Seoul. That is currently being relocated to around here. And you can see what the impact is of that on China around here. The Americans have got the ability to essentially project, you know, deny the whole of that Yellow Sea area to China if there were increased tensions. You know, clearly the Chinese are even more reluctant, therefore, to see that American presence going anywhere near there, because that would represent another source of threat for them going forward. So the Chinese are quite happy to see the peninsula divided. No US troops. Japan would be faced with a major competitor of a nation that would have about 74, 75 million. It has its own interests for essentially retaining the peninsula divided, because it would see a new unified Korea as being a significant threat to its own economic interests. And for the USA, there is also an element of also wanting to retain the status quo, because essentially, and this is the concern that I was hearing from South Korean people, is that the biggest concern they have is that there is essentially a deal, or deal would take place between the United States and China, where effectively the United States leave North Korea to be managed by the Chinese in return for allowing Chinese to promote their interests in the South China Sea. So the problem that everyone has is that everyone outside of the Korean Peninsula, and possibly also including North Korea, have a vested interest in retaining the present situation on the peninsula as is. The next point I just wanted to make was this issue of Dorisan Station, which is this place, which I was able to visit. This place, the station is essentially the last train station before the demilitarized zone that splits North Korea and South Korea. Essentially, it's the end of the line, but if there was a unification taking place, Dorisan has the ability to be a significant way station for changes to South Korea's economy. And I can explain why, again, by looking at this map here. The problem that South Korea has is that essentially it is an island, albeit it's a peninsula. It can't go anywhere there. But in one of those sort of interesting quirks of globalization, in the 1930s, someone could actually technically get on a train from Seoul, rather technically they could, go through sort of Manchuria into Russia, and could actually go to Europe within about 2 weeks. And a unification offers major advantages for South Korea, because I think Salvatore raised it earlier, to get anything of cars and whatever, it takes ships, I believe, something of the order of 3 months, that's what I was hearing, to go to Europe. Whereas clearly, if this railway station was the way first on the line through North Korea, you'd then have the ability to either go through the Russian Far East or through the China on this sort of great road that they're talking about, which would cut distances for exports to something of the order of about 10 days. That is something the South Koreans are very keen on seeing. The issue, of course, is that North Korea is reluctant to see that happen because of issues in terms of its own stability. The exposure of North Korean citizens to people from South Korea or even from Japan to build that line are viewed as more than outweighing any potential transit fees that they may earn. This slide sort of basically alludes to one of the central issues that are facing South Korea and President Moon. But I've alluded to the fact that the chaebols, which are the big South Korean firms, are heavily involved in the removal of the previous president, because they were clearly making payoffs to the president and her close associate. But the chaebols historically have also been involved in the sunshine policy in the 90s, whereby North Korea started to open itself up, and the chaebols, I think one was Hyundai, who ended up running a tourist resort in North Korea, were part of that particular putting the money in to try and get North Korea to basically start to function as some form of economy. Now the chaebols probably will probably be retained by President Moon to do something probably very similar in terms of financing investment and financing some infrastructure in North Korea as part of an easing of the tensions. But the big problem that South Korea has is that there is essentially no real political consensus on how to deal with the North Korean problem. If I just look at the German experience and Willy Brandt, the opportunity that Germany had was that when Willy Brandt launched the Ostpolitik, which was to reach out to the East German and also the Soviet Union, he commenced that in the 1960s. And even despite criticism from the Americans, and anyone who's read the Kissinger memoirs will know that this sort of outreach to the Soviets caused considerable grief to the Americans at the time. There was essentially a consensus in the German political elite that reach out to the East needed to work. That is not existing right now in South Korea. Because after Brandt had resigned and his successor, Helmut Schmidt, left office, it was the CDO under Helmut Kohl who still promoted that reach to the east. And there were some very, very unpleasant compromises along the way. There were considerable amounts of money paid by the German government to the East Germans to allow separated families to reunite. The big issue that's happened in Korea, the Korean Peninsula, over the last 20 years is there has never been any such consensus. Some of that, no doubt, influenced by the painful experiences of the war and the losses. But I think the issue is that South Korea fundamentally has to change at the political elite level in order for there to be at least the start of a North Korean Ostpolitik policy. I think the one thing it's worth bearing in mind is that everyone views that sort of Ostpolitik as being, obviously a crowning success. But along the way, there were, as I said, very painful compromises in terms of essentially bribes being paid by the Germans, West Germans to the East Germans. But there were also considerable tensions along the way, particularly in the late 70s and the 80s with the Cold War hotting up and the Reagan presidency. But that policy had broad acceptance and ultimately came to fruition in 1989 with the reunification. South Korea is very much at the beginning of that. And what I would hope, a bit unusual for such a talk, but I would hope that President Moon can actually manage that difficult issue of trying to build a long-term consensus amongst the political elite to push the reunification along, notwithstanding the opposition of the North Korean regime. But it has to get involved in effecting a transformation in North Korea, notwithstanding the neighbors' deep reservations about a reunified peninsula. And to round off, I clearly go back to the sort of the influence of Fleetwood Mac and this song, which was, if we go for the second paragraph, Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. don't stop, it'll sue me here, it will be even better than before. And I hope that one of the last great divisions of the world, of world history, will essentially resolve itself. And I trust that President Moon will start on that as a matter of course. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Прошу,
Any questions?
шановні друзі, питання, коментарі. Sure.
I enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. In 1592,
Yes.
Japan invaded Korea, and China came to the defense of Korea.
It's true.
And the war between Japan and China stabilized right around the 38th parallel, with Seoul and South Korea in Japanese hands and Pyongyang and North Korea in Chinese hands. That war was quickly resolved because Japan was not strong enough to maintain its control over the South, and Korea was reunified within a few years under China. In 1950, there was a similar dynamic. It reached a stalemate by 1952 between Seoul and Pyongyang in the same place, dividing the peninsula, with the difference that South Korea was now supported by an almost godlike power from outside the region. No United States, no division of Korea. So, to my mind, the important player here is really China. Right? Korea was brought under Chinese influence for most of its history. The period in the 20th century has been an anomaly, but even today North Korea is under Chinese influence. And I'm curious what role you think China plays, just giving all that as background, this long-term influence of China. What role do you think China plays in North Korea? If the North Korean regime collapsed, would China send in troops to maintain order in North Korea? China did that in 1950. Would it do it again in 2017? I just want to ask you to think very broadly about the role of China in North Korea.
You're absolutely right on the importance of China. I think there are a number of aspects on the Chinese role with North Korea. One of the current issues that it's out there is clearly the nuclear dimension from North Korea. What is probably little known is why the North Koreans went down a nuclear route. The nuclear program actually started in the 70s and 80s. And in fact, the North Koreans acknowledged to the Americans that one of the reasons why they went down the nuclear route was because of concerns over China. Really? China. Not the United States per se, but China, because of issues of potential involvement by China in sort of territorial disputes, and also because of concerns that China would use its position to essentially undermine the North Korean regime. The issue, now go forward a bit, people will be familiar with the assassination of Kim's half-brother in Kuala Lumpur airport a few months ago. Now the issue there is that the half-brother was based in Macau, And certainly the strong suspicion is that China essentially had the half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, I think his name was, essentially as their backup if they wanted to intervene in North Korea. And therefore, that was going to be a very, very good motive for the North Koreans to assassinate him, because essentially he was under Chinese security and protection. It's very unclear why he went to Kuala Lumpur. The speculation is that it was either business or a personal interest in going. But once he left the China haven, I mean, he was essentially a target. And again, the concern is that he was going to be used by the Chinese as a possible replacement. The issue is that China is very, very involved in North Korea economically. People will be aware that China tried to make a big thing out of it. It was halting the coal imports from North Korea because it essentially used up or had fulfilled its quota. But let's be very clear, the Chinese have also got very significant interests in North Korea, particularly in mining and particularly in all the business ventures. So I think there is great reluctance by the Chinese to do anything that could compromise those business interests, which are wide-ranging and of reasonably considerable import to particular parties in the Chinese regime. The Chinese view North Korea as, and probably actually the Korean Peninsula, as essentially a bulwark against the US. And as I said, one of the things that did prompt their involvement in the 1950s was a very clear threat that they made, which is if the Americans did approach the border, they would essentially intervene. And they did, and they lost 1 million troops as a result of that. So for them to sort of see a unified Korea would fulfill one of their worst nightmares, which is to have the Americans back on their border. So I think for all these reasons, the Chinese will be very, very reluctant to intervene. I think they will continue to live with the embarrassment of the regime in the north and also its sort of nuclear tests and ballistic missile tests. And their intervention, if it did come, would be accompanied by significant enhancement in their own position, which the Americans may be able to provide. I think it's also quite clear that there is also some form of grand bargain going on, because the Americans have actually stopped doing any challenges of of China's presence in the South China Sea. Clearly as a sort of like a reward for the China to try and make some discreet contacts with the North Korean authorities. I might also say, and I go back to this point, one of the few things I will say in Trump's favor is that he may well actually, albeit he's going to face considerable resistance, I think, in the United States, he seems to actually be one of the few presidents who may well be prepared to take risks for a possible peaceful resolution of the problems on the peninsula. And for that, I actually think he's probably, he deserves some measure, some modicum of congratulation. Because I think the American position on North Korea has essentially become too firmly entrenched. I think the when President Clinton was trying to do a similar reach out to the North Koreans with the nuclear reactors to try and, clearly that deal was essentially reneged on by the Americans, and the North Koreans are not in much of a mood to trust the Americans. So this sort of constant sort of aggressive rhetoric by the Americans and the continual exercises have not done anything to bring about change. And I think Trump is right in this particular instance to try and gamble on perhaps a different approach.
Thank you. Ще питання, шановні друзі? Якщо немає, подякуємо нашому доповідачеві.